Check. There we are. All right. All right, we're going to go and get started here, and if more people shuffle in, that's fine. Okay, we got the slides on. Okay, so this is Science Confirms Biblical Creation, and I think this is helpful because the narrative in our culture is that science proves evolution, that to be scientific, you certainly can't be a creationist, you have to be an evolutionist. I take issue with that as a scientist who is a creationist, as a Christian who believes the Bible, as, by the way, most of the founding fathers of the disciplines of science were. They were biblical creationists. Yeah, they were not evolutionists. But in any case, we've been taught that science proves evolution, and that, in fact, a lot of times, even the way the evolutionists will phrase the debate, it's like science versus creation. And I would reject that. I've got an article on the website, Science versus Evolution, because that's a little more accurate. But in any case, the reason that we come to different conclusions is because we have a different lens through which we view the universe. Biblical creationists use the Bible to interpret the evidence, as we should. The Bible's the inerrant word of God. We should be using that to interpret the evidence around us. Secularists look at the universe through the lens of secular humanism. That's the way they look at things, and that affects the conclusions that they draw. But we're looking at the same world. We're looking at the same fossils. We're looking at the same genetic structures. I look at the same stars and galaxies as my secular colleagues, and we come to different conclusions about what it means because of the lenses that we use. Secularists have this mental lens that everything that happens by natural processes, that millions of years have shaped the earth and the organisms on it, millions of years of deaths, struggling disease, bloodshed, extinction, and so on. And that's how life on Earth came about. And when they look at fossils, they already have that worldview in their mind, and they begin to interpret the data in that way. Now, I look at the universe through the lens of Scripture, and we often use what we call the 7 C's of history. It's just a nice little way of remembering biblical history by 7 words that start with the letter C, starting with creation, where God made a world that he himself called very good. God looked at everything he'd made, and behold, it was very good. And then it didn't stay that way very long, because then we have corruption. God gave Adam charge, dominion over the earth. And when Adam rebelled against God, corruption came into the world, and we now live in a world that is corrupted by sin, but God has not left us completely to our sin, fortunately. Then we have the catastrophe, where the wickedness of mankind became great, and God judged the world with a global flood. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and so the Lord instructed him on how to prepare an ark that would save his family and 2 of every air-breathing kind of land animal, 2 of each. And then we have the confusion of tongues that happened at the Tower of Babel when people again rebelled against God. They hadn't learned the lesson. And so God confused their languages, and that's how we end up with the different languages that we have in the world today, along with the different people groups, the so-called ethnicities that we have in the world today that would be responsible for that. Christ, God himself, steps into history, something he'd promised to do back when Adam and Eve first fell into sin. He promised the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And then Christ accomplishes that on the cross, where he pays for our sin and makes us positionally righteous and begins the process of making us practically righteous. But that's not complete until the eternal state. The 1 C that has yet to happen in its fullness is the consummation, where there will be a new heavens and a new earth, and the curse will be lifted, and there will be no more death, suffering, sorrow. And that's something we all look forward to, of course. And that process, in a way, begins when you get saved, because if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. And so we've started that, but we haven't seen the end of it yet. Now, when I look at the world, I use that true history of the universe, recorded history by eyewitnesses, and ultimately inspired by God, and therefore trustworthy. Evolutionists are using a guess about the past to interpret their data. I'm using the recorded history of God's Word. And we're going to look at, what I'm going to do is show you that when you look at the evidence through the biblical lens, it makes sense. My goal this afternoon is not actually to prove the Bible. I think it is provable, but I use a different method when I do that. I just want to show you that the evidence is consistent with God's word, and therefore refute the narrative that to be scientific, you must be an evolutionist. That is simply false. We're going to look at 3 fields of science this afternoon. We're going to look at genetics, the study of how traits are passed on from one organism to the next, from one generation to the next. We're going to look at information theory, which is something maybe you haven't heard of, but it's very confirmative of biblical creation. And it's something you should know about in this computer age, so I think that's helpful to discuss. And then finally, we'll talk about geology, rock layers, as well as the fossils that are found within these rock layers. And so these are the fields that we will hit, and we'll spend the most time on the first one, genetics, because this, I believe, is the most relevant to the creation versus evolution issue. Genetics is the study of heredity, how organisms pass on traits from one generation to the next, the study, if you will, of how animals change or how organisms change over time. And so my first question is, do animals change over time? Take dogs, for example. Do dogs change from one generation to the next? Do they? They do. What did they change into? Dogs, yeah. So there you go. Dogs change into dogs. But you can get different breeds. And we're going to see how that works. God has built into animals the ability to diversify within certain limits. They can't diversify forever. They can't, track their environment wherever it changes. There are limits to how they can change. And we'll see how they change and how that happens. But they don't change kinds. And we would expect that because the Bible indicates that God created animals after its kind or after their kind. That's a phrase that's used 10 times in Genesis. We better take it seriously. And so the kind seems to be the reproductive limit of an organism. So 2 organisms are the same kind if they do have a common ancestor. Now, in the evolutionary view, there's really only one kind because everything shares a common ancestor. But we would say, no, God created separate categories of organisms back at creation. They've diversified a bit since then, but they remain the same kind. It's important to point out kind does not mean species. Species is a very modern classification system. It's perfectly legitimate, but it doesn't have to be the same as the Hebrew word for kind, baramin. So they're not the same thing. Species was invented much, much later. It's only a few centuries old. So I have to point this out because sometimes evolutionists will misrepresent what it is that creationists teach. And they'll say, well, creationists believe that God created each species as we see it today. That is not what we believe. Okay? Or, sometimes even in their current locations. God made every species as it is today in its current location. Well, that's absurd. A lot has happened in 6,000 years. Animals have migrated. Animals have diversified into different breeds and so on. So this is a misrepresentation of what we believe. I don't believe that God created poodles back in the Garden of Eden because the world was very good. Okay, so, right? I mean, you're not going to have that. So what we do believe is more like this: changes within kinds. Yes, you can get diversification. Some of them pretty well diversified, but you notice they remain the same kinds. Change within a kind. That's what we do believe. And so I do believe that God made dogs back at creation, but they have diversified into the different breeds, including, unfortunately, poodles. Okay, but that's what we have here. And of course, some of those kinds have gone extinct. Some varieties have gone extinct, but other varieties of the same kind live. Like elephants. We think elephants are genuinely related to mammoths. They're the same Genesis kind, but the mammoth variety has gone. The elephant kind remains. There's at least a couple different elephant kinds. There's the Asian and African and so on. And then in the evolutionary view, change is upward and unlimited. This is essentially what they believe. They believe that all life has descended from a common ancestor. That was Darwin's claim. He didn't attempt to explain how the first life got around, by the way, so he never did get around to explaining the origin of species in his book, The Origin of Species. But he did try to make a claim that all life is descended from a common ancestor. Everything is related. And so the idea of distinct kinds is foreign to an evolutionary worldview. Now, to see which of these two is most consistent with science, we need to know about DNA. This is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a very long molecule that exists in the cells of your body, and it looks like a twisted ladder. And on the rungs of this ladder are nucleotide base pairs. And there are 4 different chemicals, And if you have a C on one strand, you'll have a G on the complementary strand. And if you have an A on one strand, you'll have a T on the complementary strand. So the C's and G's line up, the A's and T's line up. But on a given strand, you don't know which letter is going to come next. You know, C, C, T, A, C, T, 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 G. You don't know which one's going to come next. And based on the arrangement of those four letters, think of it as a four-letter alphabet, it spells words that basically, three-letter words that tell the cell which amino acid to put next in a particular protein. And we're basically made of proteins, these little machines, basically. And so that's instructing your body on how to build itself. It's really remarkable. It's absolutely amazing. It blows my mind to think of this. I mean, we think we're clever when we can get all this information on a DVD or a Blu-ray. God put the information to make you on a molecule. A big molecule, but still a molecule. And it's divided up into chromosomes and so on. We won't get into all the details of that. But it's a little bit like you could spell help with beads on a rope in Morse code. If you know Morse code, you can do that. Depending on how they're arranged, you can spell information. Likewise, DNA, you could theoretically write a book in DNA. And you just need to know the code there. And that's the book that God used to make you. And the reason you're a person and not a cabbage is you have instructions in your DNA to make a person, and cabbage has DNA instructions to make a cabbage. And you got the long end of the stick on that one, believe me. Okay? You have two sets of DNA. Your parents had two sets of DNA. And it's actually the combination. The two sets are not exactly identical. They can have little differences. And those differences are responsible for the little differences that we see in this room. Different hair color, different eye color, different height and build and so on. Even your personality, perhaps to some extent, are determined by the instructions on your DNA. And the particular combination of the two instructions. And so when mom and dad have children, each child gets half of their DNA from one parent. And a section of DNA that controls a trait is called a gene. So the genes are shown in different colors there. A gene is a section of DNA that controls a trait like eye color or hair color or blood type. And it's the combination of the two genes on your two sets of DNA that determines your trait. And you don't know which gene you're going to get from which parent in advance. So the first child gets this combination. The next child gets a different combination. The next child a different combination, and so on. That's why if you have brothers or sisters, they look a little bit like you, but they look a little different. You have some differences. You got some of your traits from your dad, some from your mom. You might have traits that neither parent has because you have a unique combination. You have a combination that's not found in either parent. I want to show you this with blood type because I think it's pretty easy to understand. Blood type, there's three possible genes, which are called alleles. That's a possible gene. And if you have an A and an A, your blood type will be A. So you get an A from dad, you get an A from mom, your blood type's A. If you get an A from dad and an O from mom, your blood type is still A, because A is dominant, O is recessive. Sometimes one gene will sort of conquer another. It'll take it over. And likewise, if you get an O from dad and you get an A from mom, your blood type is still A. Here's the combination that produces the B type there in the middle. If you get an A from one parent and a B from the other, your blood type will be AB. And the only way you can have blood type O is to get the O from dad and the O from mom, and then your blood type will be O, because O is a recessive gene. So those are the four blood types that are found in human beings, because those are the possible combinations. But here's what I want to illustrate. If mom has blood type A, and let's say she has the heterozygous combination, O and A, hetero meaning different, and dad also has dad has blood type B, but it's heterozygous B, so an O and a B. The children could have any possible blood type. They could get the A gene from mom and the O from dad, and their blood type would be A, like mom. They could get the B from dad, the O from mom, and their blood type would be B. So the first child would say, hey, my blood type's like mom. The next child says, my blood type's like dad. The next child, though, gets A from mom and B from dad and has blood type AB. And the next child gets the O from mom and the O from dad and has blood type O. And he says, wait a minute, mom has blood type A, dad has blood type B, I'm blood type O. Am I adopted? No. You can have that. That's a possible combination. And so that's why you might have traits that neither of your parents have, because you have a unique combination of DNA. Unless you have an identical twin, you have a unique combination of DNA. Isn't that neat? And so think about this, all the traits that are built into all of us, the information for that was built into Adam and Eve. And because of the way that the different combinations pan out, we get all these different combinations of human. That is a clever way of generating an enormous amount of variety by using the different combinations. And if you do the math, the number of possible combinations, oh, it's enormous. It turns out that mom and dad, two people, a married couple, could produce more unique children than there are atoms in the universe. That's the number of possible combinations. And it's not like a little more than the number of atoms in the universe. It's a lot more. So that's the number of possible combinations. And God, of course, God knew in advance exactly which ones would come to pass. And I believe he determines that providentially, of course. Here it is with skin color. We basically all have the same skin color, brown. It's just a question of how much do you have. There's a pigment called melanin. There's a couple forms of it. There's a gray form and there's a yellow form. We're going to look at the gray form here. And depending on how much of this melanin you have, you'll either have very dark brown skin or you'll have very light brown skin. People talk about white people and black people. No such thing. We're all brown, right? And if you put a white piece of paper next to me, you'd say, yeah, you're not white. You're brown. I mean, I'm pretty pale, but I'm not pale like a piece of paper. So that depends on how much melanin you have. And if you have these type of genes up in the upper left corner, you tend to have very dark skin. If you have the genes in the lower right corner, you have very light skin. Now think about it. Suppose you're in the box in the lower right, like I am, and you get married to somebody in the lower right, your kids are going to be in the lower right because it's only the lowercase letters that are available, you see. And likewise, anywhere along that diagonal, where if you get married to somebody in the same box, your kids will be in that box. But if you go off axis, let's say you go to the upper right, where you have big A, big B, little b, and you get married to somebody in that box, your kids could have any skin shade from very light to very dark. And so we actually think Adam and Eve were in that upper right box. There's other ways God could have done that, but that's one way he could have done it. So we think Adam and Eve had a middle brown skin color. So if you've seen those children's books where Adam and Eve are portrayed as Caucasians, that's not accurate. At least we don't think so. We think it's more likely they had a middle brown skin color. And it would have been very exciting for them when they had kids. I wonder what shade this one's going to be. I wonder what shade that one's going to be, right? Lots of variety there. And there's still places in the world today where that happens. Places in India where at the same dinner table you'll have very dark skin and very light skinned siblings. So that can still happen today because they have the heterozygous combination, like in the upper right. We're going to focus in on dogs because dogs reproduce relatively quickly and have tremendous variety built into them. And so we'll see how this works with the dog kind, and we'll see that it is very consistent with biblical creation, with God putting that information in the original dogs, and then they have diversified as certain combinations come out when they reproduce. But here's the thing I want to point out. According to the evolutionary idea, something like bacteria, single-celled organisms, eventually became something like a horse as they reproduced over millions of years. They gave rise to horses. But bacteria have instructions in their DNA to make bacteria, and that's it. That's the only thing they can make. Horses have a lot more information in their DNA. It's not just that they have more DNA, which they do, but they have more instructions in their DNA, more information. For example, a horse has instructions in its DNA on how to make bones. Bacteria do not have instructions in their DNA on how to make bones, and they can't make bones. A horse has instructions in its DNA on how to make eyeballs and ears and nostrils and so on. Bacteria lack those instructions, right? Which is why the bacteria can't make those traits. Now, if bacteria eventually became horses, if that turned into that, at some point it had to gain brand new instructions. It had to gain the instructions on how to make bones. It had to gain the instructions, the information on how to make nostrils. It had to gain the genetic information on how to make eyeballs. Is that pretty clear? Evolution can't work unless brand new information is added to the DNA. And that's very interesting because all the processes that we know of in nature do not do that. They either reduce genetic information or are perhaps neutral. And that's what I want to show you in the next little segment here. So I want to say this a couple different ways to make sure you get it. Evolution cannot happen unless brand new genetic information is added to the DNA. Evolution is all about an increase in information, but the processes we observe in nature reduce genetic information. They are the opposite of evolution. One such process is natural selection. A lot of people think natural selection is the same as evolution because Darwin tried to spin it that way. He tried to He linked the two together and said natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. And it's easy to demonstrate natural selection. So if you can demonstrate that, he thought he could get people to believe in evolution. But what I want to show you is that natural selection is the opposite of evolution. Natural selection is true. It does happen, and it's the opposite of evolution. So here's how it works. Suppose you have two dogs, and each of these dogs has a gene for short fur and a gene for long fur, and suppose those genes have a combined effect, so you have medium length fur. Okay, now this is simplified, but the basic genetic principles here are true. If you have two of these dogs, a male and a female, and they then have pups, some of the pups will get the short gene from mom and the short gene from dad, and they will have short fur, okay, because that's the SS combination. Now, some dogs will get the short gene from one parent, the long gene from the other, and they will have medium length fur, just like their parents. Statistically, 50% of the offspring will likely have that combination. And then some dogs will get the long gene from mom and the long gene from dad, and they will have very long fur. And so we can see that in one generation, we have variation within a kind. Now, there's no evolution happening yet because, well, they're still dogs, and they always will be. And so not only have they not turned into another kind, they haven't gained any new information. Because in the original dogs, we had information for short and long, and by combination, medium length fur. And the dogs that ended up actually resulting from that had short, long, and medium length fur. So far, no evolution. Let's suppose the environment gets really cold. What's going to happen? The dogs that have the shorter and medium length fur, they don't do so well in a cold climate, right? They're not well insulated against the cold. Worst case scenario, they die, sadly, right? But the dogs that have the longer fur, they're well insulated against the cold, and so they have no problem with it. Now, granted, that's a worst case scenario, but maybe the medium and short length haired dogs, maybe they don't die, but they have to find shelter because they can't survive against the cold, and so they're not able to go out and meet other dogs because they have to spend all their time finding shelter. Whereas the dogs with the thick fur, they're perfectly happy in a cold environment, and so they meet other dogs that have also survived because they also have long fur. And when they reproduce, what will the dogs have? Long fur, yeah. And you can see that that's the only kind of dog they can produce because that's the only gene left is the long fur. And so what happens is that this is an example of natural selection because the environment got cold, and the only dogs that survived are the ones that were already well suited for that environment. Now, it's not the case that the dog said, gee, it's cold, I'm going to grow long fur. No, they already had long fur, and it happened to benefit them in that environment. And so there you go. The other dogs that were not well suited to that environment, if they're not sufficiently well suited, they die, and they're not able to pass on their genes, okay? Now, is this evolution? No. Because have we gained any brand new information? No, we've lost information. We started with information for short and long, and by combination medium. What did we end up with? Just information for long. That's it. And so we've actually lost genetic information. We have not increased it. Now, if we started the experiment over and you got all three varieties again, and this time it gets really hot, what's going to happen? Well, the dogs that have the longer fur, now they don't do so well in a hot environment, and so they die from heat stroke, sadly. But the dogs that survive are the ones that have the shortest fur, and they meet other dogs that have survived because they also have short fur, and they reproduce dogs that have short fur because that's the only combination left. Great example of adaptation. The environment got hot, and the dogs developed short fur, not in response to the environment, but because some of them already had that trait, and they just happened to survive better in that environment. But again, is this evolution? Have we gained any new information? No, we've lost information. We started with information for long and short, and by combination medium, and we ended up with information just for short. See, natural selection is the opposite of evolution because it reduces genetic information by eliminating those varieties that produce traits that are not conducive to survival in a particular environment. And so this is how we account for the dogs in the natural world. Those that end up in a cold climate, sure enough, they have longer, thicker fur. If they didn't, they would die. Those that end up in the hotter environments tend to have the shorter, thinner fur. If they didn't, they would die. So there you go. And then the dogs that spread out, yeah, that's what you have there. And so you only need two dogs on Noah's Ark, And as they spread out from the mountains of Ararat, you end up with lots and lots of dogs. They branch away from the mountains of Ararat, and they carry certain traits with them. And if the traits happen to be conducive to survival in that particular environment, then those dogs survive in that environment and they reproduce, and you end up with dogs with traits that are well suited to their environment. That's an example of natural selection. I do have to point out that some traits are irrelevant to survival, or not strongly relevant, like eye color. That really doesn't make any difference in terms of survival. And so it just happens, just whichever dogs happen to have blue eyes, they happen to travel this way. That's called genetic drift. It's like natural selection, but there's no actual survival value, let's put it that way. So sure enough, dogs that end up in the cold climates tend to have the thicker fur genes. Or if they didn't, they would die. Those that end up in the hotter climates tend to have the thinner, shorter fur genes. If they didn't, they would die. And so this is a great example of natural selection, but it is the exact opposite of evolution because no new genetic information. The two dogs on Noah's Ark already had in their DNA the possibility for long or short fur because they had a heterozygous combination, as we saw. This is how you end up with the different dogs, the different wild dogs that we have in the world. It's just the various combinations of genes that God put in the dog kind, and then certain varieties of those emerging as they reproduce. Certain combinations emerge, and if those combinations are conducive to survival in that climate, then the dogs survive in that climate and reproduce those genes. So this makes sense, but it's not evolution because there's been no new genetic information. It's still A, B, C. It's just big A, big B, little b, big C. There's no Z's in there. There's been no new information added. So there you go. Now, what about mutations, though? Because evolutionists will say, but Dr. Lisle, it's not just natural selection. It's natural selection and mutations. That's the modern synthesis. It's those two things that work together to make evolution happen. Well, what is a mutation? A mutation basically is a mistake in your DNA. Think of it as a typo in your DNA. And contrary to what you see in the movies, mutations do not give you superpowers. They actually give you disease, all right? They're not good. You don't want mutations, so don't microwave yourself. It's not good. So suppose you have dogs that have information for 4 normal legs, which all dogs should have. They should have that information. But then when their DNA is being copied, sometimes a mistake is made. And so some information is lost, and you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs. He's missing some instructions, and so his legs do not form properly. So he ends up with short, stubby little legs. That's a loss of information, folks. So here's my point. I hope you can see this right off the bat. Mutations are not going to drive evolution because evolution requires an increase in genetic information. Mutations reduce genetic information. They're the opposite direction. You had dogs with instructions for 4 normal legs, and because some of those instructions got lost or scrambled, you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs. Now, here's the interesting thing to think about. A dog like that is not going to do very well in the wild, is he? Not on those short, stubby little legs. He can't run very fast. He can't catch anything. He's more likely to be caught by something else, right? So in nature, in the wild, mutations are actually held at bay because animals that have them tend to die, okay? And so especially the more severe mutations, there's some mutations that cause your heart not to form properly. You're not going to pass that on to your descendants because you're dead. There are some mutations that are fatal. And so even before you're born, you're stillborn because your body can't handle it. You're missing vital instructions. Those mutations are always eliminated because the organism dies. But then there are mutations like this that just make life really inconvenient for that poor little dog because he can't run very fast, okay? And mutations like that, some of them get through because maybe that dog can survive, but probably not. He's probably not going to do well in the wild. But here's the thing. Some people like dogs with short, stubby little legs because it can't jump up on you as much, okay? And so people will take these little critters into their home, and that little dog doesn't have to survive in the wild. He doesn't have to catch anything because he has a human caretaker to take care of all of his needs and to spend millions of dollars trying to keep that little thing alive, okay? And so there you go. So domestic breeds of dogs are full of mutations. Yes, they are. Domestic breeds of dogs are full of mutations. You'll find domestic breeds of dogs that couldn't possibly survive in the wild because they're missing they're missing instructions, but they have a human caretaker that takes care of all of their needs. So there you go. There's a mutation, for example, that causes a dog's snout not to form properly. A dog's supposed to have a long snout, but there's a mutation that causes the snout to be short, but the lower jaw sticks out because it was designed to fit the longer snout, so he has a horrible underbite. The skin was designed to fit the longer snout, so it kind of hangs off the side, and if you don't clean it and get infected and stuff. And some people think that's cute, but you think the dog says, gee, I love having my nose stuffed into my face. That's great, right? Maybe not. But domestic breeds do have problems. Poodles, for example. Poodles have some problems because of these mutations that have accumulated in their genome. These are some of the actual diseases that poodles can get, either as a direct result of a mutation or a secondary result. For example, there is a mutation that causes a poodle's hair to grow forever. Remember we talked about long fur versus short fur, and poodles actually have hair, and that gene has been damaged. And so they cannot regulate their hair growth. Their hair grows forever. A poodle could not possibly survive in the wild because, after a short period of time, it would just be a big poof ball, right? And that's why you will never see a National Geographic special about, out in the Australian outback, the mighty poodle stalks his prey. You'll never see that. You'll never see that. If you see a poodle, it has a human caretaker that gives it a haircut every now and then. And see, if you don't give it the haircut, the hair can get in its eyes, and its eyes can get infected. They can go blind. Poodles are very subject to that. They're cute little animals. I'm not anti-poodle. I'm just saying. But they are subject to disease because of mutations. They're missing some instructions, and it causes them problems. This is not evolution, folks. This is not a dog becoming a new and improved kind of animal. This is the opposite. This is the bottom line of the dog world, really. So this is how we account for the different domestic dogs. It's just the different combinations of genes that God has placed in their genome and mutations, mistakes that have crept in that cause them to have some problems. Yes. And so that's how we account for the different domestic dogs that we find in the world. And so we think the dogs that were on Noah's Ark were more like the wolf variety. Wolves still have a lot of heterozygosity, big A, big B, little b. Lots of possibilities for variation in their offspring. But as you selectively inbreed those dogs, you concentrate the mutations, you reduce the heterozygosity until you get down to the poodle, and then that's kind of it. Okay? So, but this is not evolution because it's in the opposite direction. Evolution requires an increase in genetic information. This process, inbreeding animals, reduces genetic information, and mutations do it even quicker. When I'm explaining this to kids, I say, you can think of the information in your DNA like jelly beans. And so the wild kinds of dogs, lots of information, lots of jelly beans. And then as you selectively breed them together, you concentrate the mutations, you reduce the genetic information until you get down to the poodle, and that's kind of it. That's kind of the bottom line, right? A friend of mine who actually has one says that poodles, the dogs are, if you think of dogs like cars, the wolf would be like the Rolls Royce. A lot of extra features on it. It's the high-end vehicle. I mean, it's got stuff on it that you don't really need that just really kind of neat, like windshield wipers on the headlights. I mean, you could pull those off and the car would work just fine, right? That's an extra bonus feature. Whereas a poodle is more like a Kia. It's kind of the bottom line of the car world, right? That's it. You remove one part from a Kia, it won't work anymore because it has nothing extra on it. It's the bare minimum. And poodles are like that. They are the bottom line of the dog world. Now, could you ever... Mutations are like removing jelly beans, right? They're removing information. And so you can start with, theoretically, you could start with wolves again, and by selectively breeding them and concentrating the mutations, theoretically, you could get down to a poodle again. I don't know why you'd want to, but you could do that, okay? But could you ever turn a dog into a cat by removing jelly beans? The answer is no, because a cat has Jolly Ranchers. It has different information in its DNA, okay? Cats have different genetic instructions, and they have instructions for retractable claws and things like that. That's a neat feature. By the way, cheetahs have lost that. There's a mutation in cheetahs. They can't retract their claws anymore. So it doesn't kill them. It's just inconvenient. So anyway, And I do have to point out that some of the genetic information is the same for dogs and cats and you and me and bananas. Because evolutionists will say, but look, a lot of our DNA is similar to a banana. That's true. Because remember, DNA produces proteins, which make up you, and they make up bananas and watermelons. And because we have some of the same DNA, we have some of the same proteins, which is why I can eat a banana and gain nutrients from it. God could have made all life with totally unique DNA instructions, but then they'd have totally different proteins, and then we couldn't gain nutrients from it. If God had done it that way, the only thing we'd be able to eat is each other. You see, God knows what he's doing. There's a reason why we do have similarities in different organisms. So anyway, just to get that out of the way. So when we take a look at dogs and we see how dogs reproduce, we find they reproduce dogs. Yes, you can get different varieties, but we understand that now. That's built into the dog genome by God. This is consistent. This is good observational science because it's something we can test and repeat in the present, and it's consistent with biblical creation, with God creating the original dogs. They've diversified somewhat since then, but they remain dogs and always will be dogs. They've lost some instructions, which is how you get some of the diseases that you find in modern breeds. Domestic dogs tend to have health problems, whereas the wild dog that lives on its own, you can practically run them over with your car and they get up and wave at you. They're healthy, they're fine, right? So there you go. So here's another point though I have to point out that mutations can be beneficial by losing information. There are occasionally mutations, mistakes, that actually help an organism survive in a particular environment. And I'll give you some examples of those. I'll give you just one example for the sake of time. Antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance. So it turns out that certain bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics through mutations. But my point is, it's still the opposite of evolution because evolution requires new genetic information, an increase in genetic information. Mutations reduce it. The fact that they occasionally help an organism survive is irrelevant. They can't possibly turn one kind into another because you'd need new genetic information. So here's how it works with bacterial resistance. There is a bacterium called H. pylori, which causes stomach ulcers. And you don't like having stomach ulcers, so you go to your doctor and he gives you an antibiotic. The antibiotic is something that your body can't process. It kind of ignores it. But the antibiotic goes into the bacterium, and the bacterium has an enzyme, part of his system. An enzyme is a protein that acts like a little machine. And that enzyme interacts with the antibiotic and converts it into a poison. And the poison kills the bacterium. And you feel better until you get your medical bill. Okay? And then, but there is a mutated form of H. pylori that lacks the ability to produce that enzyme because of mutations. He's missing some instructions and he can't produce very much of the enzyme. He can produce a little bit, but not very much. So the antibiotic goes into him and it just sits there because he lacks the enzyme that would otherwise convert the antibiotic into a poison. So he survives. But he survives because he's missing some instructions. And that's, by the way, why you need to take all of your antibiotic, because when you're starting to feel better, you've killed off all the normal bacteria, and the only ones that are left are these little resistant strains, these mutants. And if you don't take all of it, then they'll reproduce, and now they're harder to kill because they're resistant, you see. But they didn't survive by turning into something that's not bacteria or by gaining new instructions. They lost some information. It's just that in that unusual environment, it happened to benefit them, you see. So it's not evolution, it's the opposite. Dr. Lee Spetner, one of the world's experts on mutations, he was at Johns Hopkins University. He says, all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. Now, this is devastating to an evolutionary paradigm because in the evolutionary worldview, you have in your DNA, you have 3 billion base pairs times 2 because you have 2 sets of DNA. 3 billion base pairs. And by the evolutionist logic, those are basically information increasing mutations that produced those. But he says we haven't seen one. We haven't seen one. He says not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. Mutations reduce genetic information. They do not increase it. Yes, sometimes they'll help an organism survive. Evolutionists like to talk about good mutations, helpful mutations. That can happen in certain environments, but they only do it by reducing genetic information, and therefore they cannot drive evolution. So you see, genetics, when we understand it, it's perfectly consistent with biblical creation. God creating the original information and the original animals, and they've lost some since then. They haven't gained any new information. And that's inconsistent with evolution, which would say, no, the way we got our DNA is mutations, information increasing mutations, none of which we've ever seen. We've been talking about information in the DNA, but what is information? I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about information theory. Dr. Werner Gett, who is a friend of mine, he actually is a world expert on information theory, and he even wrote a book on it. And I'm going to kind of summarize and condense what he discovered about information. What is information? I mean, we kind of know what it is. You read a book, it's got information in it, but how would you define it? Dr. Gett, again, I'm condensing what he wrote, would define it as the following. Information always entails three things. It always entails a symbolic code system. So if I pick up a book and I see the word lion, I don't see an actual lion. I see a word that represents, encodes, the animal. Okay? So that's what a code system is. This represents that. Words represent ideas. Words represent animals and what have you. So a symbolic code system. There is always language. Information always entails language. And so when I pick up a book, it's not just a bunch of random words that symbolize things. They are organized into sentences with a subject and a predicate, right? You remember that from your elementary school. And then thirdly, there is always meaning. It's not just a bunch of random sentences that mean nothing. That I can learn something when I read a book that has information in it. And in particular, there is an expected action upon the part of the reader, and there's an intended purpose. The person who wrote the book had a reason for writing it. Let's take a cookbook, for example. A cookbook fulfills those three criteria, therefore it does have information in it. There's a symbolic code system. It says take 3 tablespoons of such and such, okay? So that those words represent ideas, quantities of ingredients, then the exact ingredients, and so on. There's a language convention, stir until it boils or whatever. And then there's meaning. There's an expected action. The expected action is that the reader will combine the ingredients in a particular way, in the way the book specifies. And there's a purpose. The purpose is so that you won't go hungry. So a cookbook fulfills all those criteria. And it turns out that when you have information, there are certain laws of nature that apply. But we need to be able to identify information, and there's how you do it. You look for a symbolic code system. You look for language. And it has to be meaningful. You have to be able to learn something from it, an expected action and an intended purpose. By the way, it doesn't matter whether the reader actually does act upon that. It's sufficient that the writer expects at least some of the readers to act upon that. The writer has a purpose for writing it. Whether they use it for that, it doesn't matter. They could use the book as a doorstop. It still has information in it because the person intended somebody to read it and act upon it. So you got those 3 criteria: symbolic code system, language, meaning, expected action, intended purpose. Could this be information? It looks like it could be. It looks like there's a code system there, some kind of icons. It seems like there's a symbolic code system. Is there language? Well, they're not just randomly spaced. It looks like they're organized into sentences. So it looks like there's a language convention there. So with the first 2 criteria, it seems like yes to both of those. The third one, does it have meaning? That's the tricky one. You have to know the code to know whether the third one applies. But fortunately, I know the code. Okay, and I can assure you this does have meaning. This is, in fact, Genesis 1 through 5 in the form of icons. Okay, so in the beginning, you got like the movie clipboard there, right? Like in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, that it was good. I love it. It's Genesis 1 through 5 in the form of icons. Isn't that neat? So it is information. It is information because there's a symbolic code system. There's language. There's meaning. There's an expected action. The Bible has an expected action that we're to read it, repent of our sins, trust in Christ. The purpose is that we might have eternal life. So the Bible, this is just a unique way of writing the Bible. It does have information in it. Now, it turns out once you identify that something has information, there are certain laws of nature that apply. Just like when you have energy, there are laws of nature pertaining to energy, like the law of conservation of energy, which says energy can't be created nor destroyed. Likewise, there are laws of information, and Dr. Werner Gitt has discovered many of them and wrote about them. He says there is one law is that information doesn't just spontaneously generate in matter. He says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Okay? So information doesn't just spontaneously generate, which means if I had a bowl of alphabet soup and I stirred up and I watched the letters assemble into the most beautiful Shakespearean sonnet, it's not going to happen, okay? Because just a random process like that will not generate new information. So where does information come from? If it doesn't just spontaneously generate in matter, where does it come from? I think you know the answer. Information always comes from a mind. It always comes from a mind. If you pick up a book and it has information in it, it comes from a mind. And Dr. Gitt explains that. He says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. So anytime you have information, it originated in a mind. Now, non-mental processes can copy information. A Xerox machine can copy information, and it has no mind. It's a mechanical device. A computer can copy information, and it has no mind. It can copy information from one place or another. And so if you pick up a book, the specific book that you hold in your hand was probably made by a machine that makes lots of them simultaneously, some kind of printing press, right? Okay, so that's fine. But where did it get its information? Probably from a computer, probably got it from another computer, all non-mental machines, but originally somebody wrote it. Originally it came from a mind. That is always the case. Even with all these amazing things, the new AI stuff that's out there that's just amazing, they can scour the internet and pick information that human minds have created and synthesized them. That's what they're doing. There's no thought, though. Machines cannot think. Humans think. But this is very intuitive to us. If you pick up a book, it wouldn't occur to you to think, well, this probably happened in the explosion in a typewriter factory. Okay? It wouldn't occur to you to think that because the book has information in it, and information comes from a mind. And that's very interesting because guess what? DNA has information in it. Well, wait a minute. We just learned that information always originates in a mind. But according to evolution, the information in DNA gradually accumulated as mutations accumulated over hundreds of millions of years, right? But that can't be because information only comes from a mind. Non-mental processes, there are processes in your DNA that copy the genetic information. Whenever one of your cells divides, it's got machinery in there that copies the DNA and makes a duplicate of it. Pretty amazing. And every now and then a mistake is made. That's a mutation. But 999 out of 1,000 mutations, your cells know how to fix them. You've got a built-in spell checker in your DNA. Did you know that? You do. You have a genetic built-in spell checker that'll fix most of them. It's not perfect, though. We live in a fallen world. But where did you get the genetic information in your DNA? You got it from your parents. Where did they get it? From their parents, from their parents, from their parents, all the way back to Adam and Eve, who got it from the mind of God. The creationist position is consistent with information theory. Because information theory says information always comes from a mind, the mind of the sender. But it's not consistent with evolution. By the way, evolutionists know in their heart of hearts that information only comes from a mind and always comes from a mind. And I know this because I did a little social experiment years ago. I posted this article. It's a satire. It's called On the Origin of Articles. And what this article tries to convince you of is that articles don't have authors, that they are a collection of typos that have been made randomly, and as they're copied, most of the typos make the article worse, but occasionally a typo makes it better somehow, and those ones tend to be passed on. So articles grow in size, in length over millions of years as the typos accumulate. It was a fun article. And so it tries to convince you as well that all articles have a common ancestor because and we know that because they have certain words in common. Like the word "the," You'd be surprised how many articles have the word "the" in it. And that shows that they're all descended from a common ancestor. They can't, because why would a creator use the same words in different articles? That makes no sense. So obviously they're descended from a common ancestor over millions of years, and they do not have authors. It was a fun article, and ridiculous, obviously. But the funny thing was the responses I got to it. Because the evolutionists chimed in and said, "We know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle." I said, how do you know that I wrote it? Did you see me write this? No? Oh, you're taking it on faith? Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And I played the evolutionist then, defending the evolutionary origin of articles, and they were trying to be creationists, but because they're not trained to think well, they couldn't do it well. Well, we could trace down the IP address and show that you posted it. Hey, I admit to posting it. When this thing evolved on my computer, it was too good not to share, right? I said, let me guess, you must be one of those authorists that believes in authors. I mean, if you want to believe in that, fine, man, but keep it in church. I'm not interested in that. Anyway, what do you teach that stuff to your children? My goodness, that articles have authors. What superstitious nonsense. I used all of their logic, and they didn't know how to deal with it. It was really interesting. Now, by the way, they could easily have refuted me. They could easily have proved that this article has an author. Maybe not that it's me, but they could prove that it has an author. All they'd have to do is say, but Dr. Lisle, that article has information in it, and information always comes from a mind. They could easily have refuted me, but not one of them did. Why? It's right. They'd have to admit evolution is wrong, because evolution has information that comes about that's not from a mind. These people would rather be reduced to foolishness than bow the knee to Christ. Isn't that interesting? That's exactly what the Bible teaches. Well, let's move on and talk about geology now, the study of rocks, and paleontology, the study of the fossils that are found in these rocks. And the first myth we have to blow up is that we know that these rocks are billions of years old because of radiometric dating. So I want to talk a little bit about that, how it works, why it really doesn't. So radiometric dating is a way of trying to estimate the age of a rock using radioactive elements that are within the rock. So we know what elements are, atoms, basically. We're all made of atoms, these little particles that have protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and then some number of electrons circling around the perimeter. And some atoms are unstable or radioactive, which means they will spontaneously change into another type of atom, usually a smaller one, okay? So uranium-238, for example, is radioactive or unstable, which means it really doesn't want to be uranium-238, and it will spontaneously change into thorium-234. You don't have to do anything to it. It'll do it itself. It'll just sit there for a while, and it's like, I'm really unhappy being uranium, and then pop, it'll eject two protons and two neutrons. It'll eject a helium nucleus and change into thorium-234. Thorium-234 is also unstable, and so it'll sit there for a little while, and then pop, it'll eject a beta particle, and then it will turn into the next atom, which is also unstable, which turns into the next, and so on. And the energy that is emitted can be detected on a radio. So it's radioactive. That's where that word comes from. It's radioactive. And so it'll keep changing to the next atom, to the next atom, all the way down to lead-206. Lead-206 is stable. So once it reaches lead-206, it'll stay lead-206 forever. Now, fortunately, most atoms don't do this. Most of the atoms that we encounter are stable. They are not radioactive, and they remain the same type of atom. But there's a small fraction in nature that do this, that are radioactive or unstable, and will spontaneously decay into other types of atoms. And we know the rate at which this happens. Now, for any given atom, you don't know when it's going to change. But statistically, if you have a lot of them, you know that after a certain amount of time, a certain fraction will have changed. It's kind of like popcorn. If you're watching your popcorn pop, you don't know which kernel's going to pop next. That one, oh, there. That one next, oh, there. You can't predict which kernel's going to pop next or when, but you do know that after about a minute and a half in the microwave, they've all popped, or 2.5 minutes, whatever it is. Okay, so that's comparable to what's going on here. You have enough of these atoms, statistically, after a certain amount of time, a certain fraction of them will have changed into the next element. And we know that rate because we've studied this in a laboratory. And for uranium-238, for all of the atoms of uranium-238 to change into lead-206 would theoretically take billions of years. We know that because over 1 year, X fraction of them have changed, and then we extrapolate that you know. And so the bottom line is, if I had a chunk of solid uranium-238 and I waited long enough, eventually some of it would be uranium, some of it would be lead, some of it would be the intermediate elements. If I waited long enough, theoretically it would all be lead. And that takes billions of years, we think, because we know that it changes a little bit over 1 year. And so the idea is, let's suppose you have a rock like that one in the middle that has some uranium and some lead in it. You could use that like a clock, because we know the rate at which it changes. We could extrapolate backward and figure out when it was all uranium. But how do I know it was all uranium to begin with? Maybe it already had some lead in it to begin with. And by the way, secular scientists do not assume that it was all uranium to begin with. They assume it had some lead in it to begin with. Yeah, they do. And so you say, well, how much lead should we start with? You tell me how old you want the rock to be, I'll tell you how much lead it started with. You see the issue there? That's called an issue of initial conditions, the assumption of initial conditions. There are 3 assumptions that radiometric dating must make, none of which are provable. The first assumption is that you know the initial ratio of uranium to lead, and you don't ever really know that. You can think of it this way. You can think of it like the sand going from the top chamber to the bottom in an hourglass. Okay, that's like uranium changing into lead. And suppose I had an hourglass in the room like that. When you came in, and I said, this is an hourglass, how long ago did I turn it over? You say, well, it looks like it's about halfway through. I'd say a half an hour. And I said, I gotcha. I turned it over 1 minute before you came in, but already a lot of the sand was in the other chamber. You assumed that all the sand was in the top chamber. You can't make that assumption. You don't know that. You don't know what it started with. Or maybe somebody added sand when you weren't looking. That's possible. With uranium and lead, uranium is leachable in salt water. It can move in and out of the rock. Or how do you know the throat of the bottle's always been the same size? Maybe sand fell faster in the past. That's probably a safe assumption for an hourglass, but we don't know why radioactive decay happens at the rate that it does. And so it may have happened faster in the past, and there's good evidence that, in fact, it did. So these are some of the assumptions of radiometric dating. If any one of those is wrong, your answer will be wrong. Your age estimate will be way off. And there's good evidence that number 2 is dead wrong. I was always taught that, there's nothing that can affect the decay rate of radioactive elements. I was taught that in school. We now know that's wrong. Scientists have found certain kinds of radioactive decay in the laboratory. We can speed them up by a factor of 1 billion. The uranium-osmium reaction has been sped up by laboratory scientists by a factor of 1 billion. It doesn't have to happen at the same rate. It could have happened faster in the past. And there's good evidence that it did. We think during the flood year or during creation or both, the decay rates were much faster. I'm not going to go into the details of that. If you want to look into it, the RATE research project is what you'll want to look up. It found evidence that number 2 is wrong. In any case, we know that radiometric dating is not reliable because we've tested it on rocks whose age we know. When Mount St. Helens erupted back in the 1980s, it erupted in 1980 and then several times since, it produced brand new rocks. And when the rock hardens from the magma, that's supposed to set the 0 point for the clock, because when it's magma, elements can move in and out. But then when it's rock, it's supposed to trap the elements. And so we took some of these brand new rocks that had formed in the Mount St. Helens eruption. We sent them in and had them radiometrically dated. We sent them to secular labs so we couldn't be accused of bias, and asked them to date these rocks, estimate their ages, and they came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on rocks that we know are brand new. That's the bottom line. Radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age. It is assumed to work on rocks of unknown age. That's the bottom line. You say that's an isolated incident. It's not. You can take rocks from Hawaii and send them in to have them dated. You'll get millions of years. Brand new rock. You can stick the pole in the magma, pull it out, watch the rock harden, send it in, you'll get millions of years. There are certain methods, isochron methods, for example, where they can actually give a negative age. Yeah, you can hold in your hand a rock that, according to radiometric dating, will not form for another million years. That's true. That's true. Yeah. What about carbon dating? A lot of people think carbon dating is what scientists use on rocks. No. They use these other methods, uranium, lead, potassium, argon. Carbon dating is used primarily on things that were once alive. In any case, things that have carbon in them, which we do. We have a lot of carbon in us. And carbon dating is better than these other methods, although it's not perfect either. None of them are. None of them are perfect, but carbon dating tends to give the right answer when we test it on things of known age. So I have a little more confidence in carbon dating. And the beautiful thing about carbon dating is it always gives answers that are roughly consistent with the biblical time scale. I mean, it might be 50,000 years instead of 5,000, but it never gives millions or billions of years, ever. Now, the way carbon dating works, it's based on C14, which is a variety of carbon. Most carbon is C12. One atom in a trillion is C14. It's got 2 extra neutrons. C12 is stable. C14 is unstable. It will decay into nitrogen. C14 is created in the upper atmosphere as cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms, convert them into C14, and then they will eventually decay back into nitrogen with a half-life of 5,730 years. That's how long it takes half of C14 to decay back to nitrogen. And when you're alive, you're eating and breathing, and you're exchanging carbon with the environment. So the plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen. And a small fraction of the carbon in that carbon dioxide, 1 atom in a trillion, is C14. And the plants use that carbon to build themselves. So a small fraction of plants is C14. And then the animals eat the plants and use the carbon to build their bodies. And we eat the animals, or we eat the plants, and we use that carbon to build our bodies. So a small fraction of you is C14, which means you're all slightly unstable, right? Yeah. And when you're alive, you're eating more C14. Now, that C14 is constantly decaying back to nitrogen, but you're replacing it because you're eating more food until you die. And then you don't eat any more food, right? So when you're alive, the C14 to C12 ratio in you is about the same as it is in the environment, 1 atom in a trillion, until you die, and then the C14 simply decays away, okay? And so the idea is by measuring the C14 to C12 in something that is dead, you can find out how long ago it died. And it works pretty well. It gives answers that are roughly consistent with the biblical time scale. It makes assumption as well. It assumes that the C14 in the atmosphere has been constant, which it hasn't. The flood disrupted that. But it gives you roughly consistent answers. And the beautiful thing is it gives answers that are wildly inconsistent with evolution. We've carbon dated diamonds. Now, in the evolutionary view, diamonds are 1 to 2 billion years old. 1 to 2 billion years old. And yet they still have C14 in them. C14, the half-life is 5,700 years. C14 can't even last 1 million years, let alone a billion. Lots of stuff like that limits the age of the earth to a few thousand years. The rate at which salt fills the ocean. Salt, even freshwater rivers have a little bit of salt in them. They pick it up from the land, dump it into the ocean at a rate of 450 million tons per year. We can measure that. And you can get rid of a little bit of it with salt sprays, but for the most part, the salt accumulates in the ocean. The water evaporates, but it leaves the salt. Salt doesn't evaporate. So the oceans get a little bit saltier every year by 450 million tons. And so you can work out the math. How long ago would the oceans have been freshwater? Turns out 62 million years is an upper limit. So the maximum possible age of the oceans, just based on the salt influx, is 62 million years. And I have to point out, that's not the true age of the oceans. That's a maximum possible age. The true age would be less than that because the oceans didn't start with fresh water. They started with salt water. So based on salt content, the oceans have to be less than 62 million years old, and yet secularists believe they're 3 billion years old. That doesn't work, but it's consistent with the biblical time scale because we think the oceans were already salty when God first made them, so they're a few thousand years old. The rate at which mud accumulates on the ocean floor, at 20 billion tons per year. Plate tectonics can get rid of maybe 1 billion tons per year. The rest of it simply accumulates. How long to take to get Earth's current amount of mud on the ocean floor, even if there's no worldwide flood? Less than 12 million years. 12 million years is the maximum possible age. That's consistent with the biblical time scale, but because we think there was a worldwide flood that would have dumped the mud quickly. But they can't be 3 billion years old. Human population, how long does it take to get Earth's current population of human beings? It doesn't take millions of years. It's very consistent with the biblical time scale of a few thousand years. A lot of stuff like that. But the best evidence we have that the Earth's thousands of years old is we have the birth certificate of the universe, signed by God. Yeah. Secular scientists say the Earth's billions of years old. Take my word for it. God says I created in 6 days. Take my word for it. That's the bottom line. I can throw all kinds of science at you, but the bottom line is, are you going to believe God or or man. That's the issue. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these for time's sake because I'm going over a little bit. But I do want to point out the kinds of fossils that we find too, because I was always taught that there's abundant evidence of evolution in the fossil record, and there really isn't. I remember having a textbook that had the evolution of the horse like that, and I'm thinking, I'm seeing different horses. Where's the evolution? Oh, but this one's big and that one's small, and their feet are a little different. Yeah, the modern horse has a single toe. There were some varieties in the past that had 3 toes instead of 1. That's a very minor variation. But these are just horses. But this one's big and those ones are small. So that one's big, that one's small. Those are both adult horses. They're just different breeds. We have different varieties today. Some of the varieties have gone extinct. There are lots of varieties of horse. What you'll find in the textbooks, if they're being honest, in terms of the actual fossils that we find, is variation within a kind. That's exactly what you'd expect if creation is true. They do not find one kind changing into another. There's no evidence of that in the fossil record. It's not there. And the rocks in which these fossils are found, don't rocks take millions of years to form? Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that took millions of years to form. I don't think cars have been around for millions of years, right? Here's a man-made clock embedded inside a solid rock. That's the one rock we know exactly when it formed, right? What about all those layers, sediment layers, some of which are now lithified into rock? There's a person down there for scale. Those must have taken millions of years, right? Actually, none of those layers existed before 1980. Those were formed in the Mount St. Helens eruption. Catastrophes can lay down rock layers very quickly. Mount St. Helens dislodged Spirit Lake, it produced a wave in Spirit Lake, which is right next to it, and that basically uprooted trees and deposited new sediment in a matter of hours. Mount St. Helens demonstrated that a lot of things creationists say can happen quickly under catastrophic circumstances can happen quickly under catastrophic circumstances. Now, it was one piddly volcano. The Bible says at the time of the flood that it says all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That might refer to underwater volcanoes all going off at the same time. That's a catastrophe. That's a catastrophe. Mount St. Helens produced a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon in a matter of hours. It doesn't take millions of years. It doesn't take millions of years. It produced these fine laminations. They used to say, because you'll find these laminations in the Grand Canyon too, and they used to say, oh, those are annual layers. One layer is deposited, the next year, the next layer is deposited, the next year. Those are annual, and there's millions of them. So see, millions of years. We now know that's false. That's not from the Grand Canyon. That's from Mount St. Helens. Those were all produced in one catastrophe. They were laid down simultaneously. That's the way the mud flows, and it produces those laminations. They're not annual, not at all. So we find trees buried vertically. We used to wonder how that happened because we have trees buried vertically without roots, and they sometimes have little bits of coal at the base. I was always taught coal forms over millions of years as peat accumulates in swamps. Were you taught that? That's what I was taught. But here's the interesting thing. We sometimes find, and you can see the coal there down to the left of the base of the tree, we sometimes find impressions of leaves in the coal. And the leaves are not from trees that grow in swamps. They're from trees that grow on mountain rainforests. What kind of catastrophe would uproot trees in mountain rainforests, rip them away from their own roots? Because these trees don't have roots on them. We didn't know until Mount St. Helens erupted because it did that. It uprooted trees like matchsticks, removed them from their own roots, and they tended to float in Spirit Lake, and most of them floated vertically because the little bit that's left of the roots would cause them to float like that. A few of them would be horizontal. Most of them would be vertical. Then eventually they'd get waterlogged and sink down, and then the sediment from the volcano would cover them up. We know how this happens now. It's not millions of years. It's catastrophic conditions. We've seen it happen. So we know how that happens. So this is good observational science. We can test this in the present. We can't go back in time and see the flood, but my point is the observations we do have in the present are consistent with what the Bible teaches about the nature of the flood as a catastrophe that happened over the entire earth. And so this is good observational science. It's consistent with biblical creation. It's not consistent with the millions of years view. And the real message of the rock layers, and the reason why secularists reject the worldwide flood, because you see the worldwide flood shows that God judges sin. And that's an uncomfortable thought because we're all sinners. We deserve God's wrath. And it's only by repenting and trusting in Christ that we can escape God's wrath because he pays the penalty for us. He endured God's wrath on our behalf. So the real message of the rock layers is not millions of years of evolution. The real message of the rock layers is repent. God judges sin because he's righteous. He did it before with a worldwide flood. He's going to do it again by fire. And no one escapes that except those who are in Christ. So I won't go through all these, but that's the point. God is a God of justice, but also a God of mercy. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord told him how to prepare a boat that could save him and his family, and Noah responded in obedience and was saved. And God closed the door on the ark. I think that's interesting. God was the one that decided time of mercy is over, time of judgment is now. And so I always like to remind people of that today is the day of salvation. If you haven't trusted and repented in Christ, today is the day you got to do it. Because you don't know when God's going to close that door. It could be at any moment. So again, let me remind you some of the resources that we have here. The importance of Genesis, which I talked about in our morning message, and understanding Genesis, which shows how it's the Bible's instructions on how to interpret the Bible, basically. And it's not just about Genesis, although I do apply it specifically to Genesis. Ultimate Proof of Creation, giving you a bulletproof argument for biblical creation. Very valuable resource. And that's the one book I wish college students would read before they go to college, because I think that might really help them to think properly. We have that on DVD as well. Taking Back Astronomy, showing how the universe declares God's glory, not a big bang or billions of years. Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, how to better enjoy the night sky from a Christian perspective. Astronomy Reveals Creation, a DVD showing you just that, how astronomy reveals biblical creation and not billions of years. Worlds of Creation takes you on a tour of the solar system from a biblical perspective. It's really a fun presentation. Created Cosmos, the planetarium show that I wrote for the Creation Museum. Lots of great resources. Do check those out. And don't forget the packs, which are today and tomorrow night only. We don't do the packs on the website. So the book pack, the best of our books together for 20% discount, our video pack, the best of our DVDs for 20% discount, or our library pack, the best of everything for a 30% discount. And we do have children's resources as well. Children get hammered with this, so please prepare them and get them to think biblically and get them rooted in truth early on. And don't forget to sign up for our free monthly newsletter. Just make sure you put your email address. And do check us out on the web as well, biblicalscienceinstitute.com. And hopefully I will see you tomorrow night when we'll talk about logic and astronomy. So thank you very much. God bless.